Primal armor. Assault armor. Shields. 3 big mechanics in Armored Core 6 that promise to have huge implications for gameplay, both offensively and defensively. But how much do we really know about them? Primal armor was introduced in Armored Core 4 as a means of shielding next from incoming fire. However, the Kojima particles that produced these barriers enabled boosting, as well as fueled many of the weapons and machinery in Armored Core 4 were highly radioactive and pollutant to the environment, which during the Lynx War would cause large portions of the globe to become uninhabitable. Assault armor was a way to sort of overload your primal armor, creating a spherical blast of energy that radiated out of your AC. However, we know that Armored Core 6 isn't set in the same world as Armored Core 4, and that Kojima particles don't exist. During an interview when Yamamura was asked if primal armor existed in Armored Core 6, he said, "Yes, as you mentioned, both primal armor and assault armor are also in Armored Core 6. But since you brought in the Kojima particles, Armored Core 6 is a whole new universe, a sort of reboot. So there are not necessarily links to previous chapters of the series. We explain the origin of assault armor and primal armor a little differently this time. So we can likely assume that primal armor, and by extension assault armor, are likely linked either to Coral itself, or at least to the energy in your AC. In 4th generation, your Kojima particle output was determined by your generator, and then your frame parts and some extensions would mold that primal armor and determine how effective and durable it was. However, in 5th generation, the mechanic was dropped entirely. Looking at the assembly footage from Armored Core 6 that we do have, we do get a brief look at some base stats for the generators, which doesn't mention anything that seems to be immediately related to primal armor or assault armor. Though in 4th generation, the ability to use assault armor was determined by your boosters, and not every AC could do it. It's entirely possible that AC6 will keep that mechanic attached to your boosters, it's just not something we've been able to see yet. Another possibility is that it's attached to the expansion slot we see in the assembly overview. The last likely scenario is that it's attached to the core itself. As in one of the early trailers, we do see the assault armor come directly out of the core. While we don't know for sure, it's been speculated that the expansion slots will fill the same sort of role that the shoulder units did in previous games. And if that is actually the case, it's interesting that we haven't actually seen any shoulder equipment on any of the ACs in the trailers or the gameplay footage, including the ones that use primal armor and assault armor, respectively. Though it's also entirely possible that there is no shoulder equipment and that the expansion slot may not have a visual indicator or at least not have a piece of equipment that we can see externally on our AC. One possibility is that the use of assault armor is one of the things tied to the newer cooldown stat on the generators, since at least by every indication, the heat mechanics we've seen previously aren't returning in AC6, and so it could be that the cooling functions of the generator serve as a cooldown mechanic for assault armor. One interesting thing to note as well is we don't actually know if they're tied together like they are in 4th generation. It's entirely possible that primal armor and assault armor are 2 separate expansion items entirely and aren't related to each other at all. If you look at the trailers and the gameplay footage, we never actually see an AC use both. Interestingly as well, in Armored Core 4, you always had your primal armor active, unless it was either fully depleted by taking fire or by using assault armor. But in the gameplay footage, there's many instances of receiving damage while we don't see primal armor active. In fact, the only place we've even seen primal armor is the early trailer. This leads me to think that either primal armor is some sort of expansion item that you manually turn on and off, or that not every AC is capable of using primal armor. They could also do something like tying the ability to use them to your core, and so some cores can use primal armor, while some cores could use assault armor. It would definitely make for an offensive-defensive trade-off depending on what playstyle you're looking to do. Though there's always been a trade-off to using assault armor, as even when they were linked together, it would drop off your primal armor for some time, and you'd have to wait for it to regenerate, leaving you fairly vulnerable, as you then had no primal armor to defend yourself with. But do you know what you do have to defend yourself with? Shields! Shields, and specifically energy shields, are returning in Armored Core 6. And at first glance, they seem to function a little mechanically different than they have in the past couple of generations. Energy shields have existed in the past, but were eventually replaced by primal armor. They were a piece of equipment that you could turn on and off, and while active, would create a barrier that reduced incoming damage at the cost of constantly depleting your energy reserves. We've also had solid shields in previous games, but they haven't actually confirmed their return in AC6, though I do expect that we'll get them. After all, if you have energy shields, why not include solid shields as well? It also adds an interesting defensive option to block specific damage types, so if your AC has great solid defense but lacks energy defense, maybe you could equip one that would be good against that damage type to help bolster your overall defense stats. One thing with energy shields that I believe will be mechanically the same as previous generations is that I expect that it will constantly drain energy while in use. We've seen that when being hit with the shield equipped, that they immediately pop out and block incoming damage within the same frame that you're hit with the attack. But there are a few instances, especially in the recent gameplay footage, that shows us being hit, and even though we have a shield equipped, it doesn't deploy and nothing happens. This leads me to think that in order to use the shield, you'll have to hold down that button, and then if you're hit with an attack while holding it down, the shield will deploy, preventing some of the damage you would receive. This theory is further backed up by the clip with the energy whip, in which we see the shield is deployed even though the enemy hasn't actually gotten close to our AC or made contact yet. This differs from previous clips where we see the shield deploy immediately when we're hit, but not before. The shield also appears to be unidirectional in that it'll block fire coming from the front, but not necessarily the sides or the back. While I doubt we'll see it, it does leave a little bit of possibility that they give us shields that block fire coming from behind us or from the sides automatically, but maybe are a little bit less effective than the one that blocks incoming fire from the front. Or it's entirely possible that that's the use case for primal armor, as it might reduce all incoming damage, but just less effectively than the front-facing shield. Another interesting thing to note here is that we know right when the shield is activated, there's a split second that the amount of damage reduction is increased. And we get to see that in action here. When the shield's deployed, there's a bigger defensive ring that radiates out. And during that time period, the damage you receive through the shield is actually going to be decreased. I actually love this as an addition, and it creates this sort of perfect guard scenario that's really going to separate the really good players from just the average ones. Being able to predict incoming attacks, especially large single-shot damaging attacks, and especially in multiplayer, I think is going to really add to the mechanical skill ceiling of the game. One thing we don't know, however, is exactly the stats of the shield and how they're going to function. There's two routes that I think they could go here, and Armored Core has done both of them previously. The first one would be that while you have the shield deployed, it just reduces a specific amount of incoming damage. And this would be my guess as to what they're going to do, at least with the energy shield, as the part itself doesn't appear to take any actual damage on impact. The other route they could go, and this may be more for solid shields if they implement them, is to give the shield actual AP itself, and then once that AP is depleted, the part breaks off or is purged respectively. In this way, you're trading one of your weapons and some of your offensive ability for essentially extra armor points. Though in addition to providing those extra armor points, the shields usually do decrease incoming damage as well until those armor points run out and they're purged off. So that's going to wrap it up for today. We don't have a whole lot of information on any of it, but there's definitely some spots that we can speculate. So let me know in the comments, what do you think about the shields? Are there something you're going to use? Are you excited about the return of primal armor and assault armor? And how do you think it's all going to function? Hopefully we'll find out some more solid info soon, but until then, there's plenty of more information and speculation to come. So I'll see you next time. Stay tuned.